family of enormous wealth who owned enormous land holdings in the vicinity of Udine. In other words, they were a leading Udine family, and they knew the Caiselli. And so one can assume that the whole business of the commissioning of this ceiling is related also to the commissioning of the Manin family for a room. The Caiselli ceiling, as we call it, was completely unknown to the Tiepolo literature, to the art community, if you like, until about just towards the end of the 19th century, when it was briefly mentioned by one or two people. Of course, even in those days, there wasn't very much in the way of books on Tiepolo. But the first books on Tiepolo, which came out around about 1910, an Italian one by a man called Molmenti, and a German volume by a man called Sack, both mention the Caiselli ceiling, and they reproduce it. So you may say that it was formally and effectively introduced to Tiepolo studies at that time. And at the same time, the Italian authorities declared that it was, as it were, a national treasure, that it was protected by the laws relating to works of art of importance, and therefore it couldn't be sold or it couldn't be exported without permission. About 10 years after that, in the early 20s, it seems that the Count Caiselli wanted to sell the picture, and he wanted to get an export license for it. And he made various attempts over a period of about 4 years to secure permission to export it. It's a long, complicated story. We have a lot of details about it, but he was always turned down. And then finally, I think in 1928, he made a false move. He rolled it up in a bale of cloth and tried to get the customs authorities in Udine to authorize its export to Trieste. Well, somehow or other, whether they were suspicious, whether they'd been tipped off, goodness knows, you know. But anyhow, they examined the roll and they found the old painting. And so, which at this point was declared to be the ceiling from Palazzo Caiselli, and was confiscated, and Count Caiselli was prosecuted under the laws for the protection of works of art. And there was a trial, a 3-day trial, which obviously caused a tremendous sensation in Udine at the time, and his defense at the trial was a very simple one. It was that the picture he tried to export was a copy. And he said, if you really want to see the real picture, it's back in my palace in Udine. Well, for whatever good or bad reasons, he was not believed, and he was condemned. The picture which had been confiscated was permanently confiscated, and he was fined 250,000 lire, which was probably quite a large sum of money in those days.
What Count Caiselli said in his own defense summarizes the problem. There were 2 paintings. While the confiscated painting was on its way to the museum at Udine, back in the ceiling cavity of the Caiselli Palace hung virtue, nobility, ignorance, and fame. This is the crux of the problem. Was one or the other a fake? Could one have been painted by a studio or by a contemporary? Or is it possible Tiepolo painted 2? All of these questions have been addressed at length, with strongly conclusive answers.
And in this particular case, of course, we have, as I say, perhaps 6 ceilings with the same subject. This is unusual. I think it would be hard to find a parallel for this in Tiepolo's own work. But the point that impressed me about the picture when I very first saw it was that it did not look like a copy, or even a fake, because the whole point of such an exercise always is to make the thing look as much like a typical Tiepolo as possible. And this picture was painted with such vigor, such a broad stroke, such lack of hesitation. It almost looked as though it had been painted with a 2-inch brush, you know. And this is simply not the way either a copyist or a faker works. I mean, this is simply not the way it ever happens. The scientific evidence can't tell you whether Tiepolo painted it or not, but the scientific evidence doesn't seem to have any sort of serious indications that the materials, the essential materials of the picture, are not of the middle years of the 18th century. No. And this, of course, is I mean, it's taken a long time to establish these facts, but they now seem to have been established quite unequivocally. When one of the early reports on the painting declared that there were traces, now this is not large quantities, but traces of aluminium and titanium, it did sound very much as though these must be 20th century materials. That seemed to be the obvious inference, in which case, of course, this was bad news as far as the picture was concerned. But then some Italian restorers were consulted who said, oh yes, we have found traces of titanium and aluminium in the grounds of several paintings by Tiepolo. Instead of being a kind of rather bad mark, as you might say, against the picture, finally turned out to demonstrate quite clearly that the ground where these things were was in point of fact exactly the same as other grounds of paintings by Tiepolo. And of course this also helps to authenticate the canvas at least and the ground as being 18th century, of 18th century origin.